Hello, I'm Donald Robertson, and this is the Stoicism Philosophy as a Way of Life podcast. Today's guest is Massimo Pigliucci, Professor of Philosophy at the City College of New York, also part of the team responsible for the Modern Stoicism organization. Massimo is the author of several magnificent books on philosophy, including How to be a Stoic, and more recently, The Quest for Character, what the story of Socrates and Alcibiades teaches us about our search for good leaders. Massimo, welcome to the show. How are you today?
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. I'm really looking forward to it. I'm in Montreal right now. Am I right in assuming that you're in New York?
Yes, Brooklyn, New York.
Cool, cool. Well, let's dive right in and we'll start with a little bit more background to introduce you to all of the listeners. How did you first get into philosophy? Let's go way back to the beginning. How did you first get into philosophy?
Well, the beginning actually goes back to high school. I grew up in Italy, in Rome, and in high school I had to take 3 years of philosophy, and the teacher was just fabulous. She
Awesome.
just made the subject come alive. I really got into it. Now, at university, I had already decided to pursue a career in science. It was in evolutionary biology to be specific, and that's
Mhm.
what I did. I stuck with it. But philosophy had kind of become a background thing, especially, of course, at the time, philosophy of science. But I was just reading whatever would come across in a bookstore, and so it kind of kept being a sort of a background thing. Yes, I'm a scientist. I'm doing experimental stuff. I was working on nature and nurture issues and stuff like that. But I was also reading philosophy. And then at some point, midlife crisis comes. And here I am, a fairly successful biologist. My research funded, my postdocs, my graduate students, everything is going fine. I have tenure at a university. But then I start thinking, okay, but do I want to keep doing this for the next 20, 30 years or whatever it is?
Mhm.
And the answer was, nah, not really. Now, at that point, fate intervened, so to speak, with hindsight at least. So I was at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, and the university there, the philosophy department there, hired a brilliant young philosopher of science, Jonathan Kaplan, who had just defended his thesis at his PhD thesis at Stanford. And Jonathan looked me up as soon as he came to campus because his thesis was on topics very similar to the ones that I was working on, but I was working at it as a biologist. He was working at it, on it as a philosopher of science. So he looked me up. We have coffee. We started coming to my lab meetings. We ate it off. We became friends. We started publishing stuff together,
Mhm.
co-authoring papers. And one thing led to another. And one day we were having lunch and I said, Jonathan, how about this? I've been looking for something different to do for the rest of my career. How about I go back to school, get my PhD in philosophy, and you be my advisor? And I still remember he looked at me and he said, how many glasses of wine did you have today? Because he was a junior faculty, right, without tenure
Mhm.
and all that sort of stuff, and I was a tenure full professor. I said, yeah, I don't drink at lunch usually. We started exploring the idea, and that's what we did for 3 years. I went back to school. I studied philosophy really seriously for the second time, I guess, after the high school bout.
Mhm.
And then eventually that led to an actual change in career. Initially, that wasn't the idea. The idea was just to expand my interests. But a few years later, I moved to New York
Mhm.
and I started applying for jobs in the area. And the first one I came out was at City University of New York, and it was in philosophy. And here I am.
And how did you get into Stoicism? Do you want to tell us a little bit about that story?
Well, that was in part of the same story in a sense, kind of a continuation of the same story. When I mentioned that I was going through a midlife crisis, it wasn't
Mhm.
just a matter of career; it was also a kind of a life thing. Nothing particularly unusual, but a couple of two or three things happened in the same year, actually, in a span of few months. An unexpected divorce, for one thing,
Mhm.
my father dying, and it's like, so okay, how do I deal with this stuff? And since I grew up, I grown up in Rome, which means that by default I consider myself early on in my life a Roman Catholic.
Mhm.
But I left the church, when I was in high school, and after that, I consider myself a secular humanist. So I thought, okay, well, here's the time to put secular humanism to the test. What kind of tools, what kind of resources does secular humanism have to help me deal with these kinds of life events, divorce, dying, of relatives and stuff like that? And it turned out the answer was not much.
Mm.
Secular humanism is a great philosophy. So in theory, it's all about following reason and science and human rights and all that sort of, and justice. Yes, that's all very nice, but when it comes to personal issues, what does that mean? I
Hmm.
couldn't find an answer. But so I thought, okay, but I am now studying philosophy seriously. Surely there is an answer somewhere. And so I kind of started to explore some practical philosophy systematically. My first stop was actually Buddhism, because a number of my friends told me, hey, you really should look into Buddhism. And I did. And I found a lot of interesting things, some of which were definitely practical. But it just didn't, the language just didn't click with me, probably for cultural reasons. It was, too alien, too distant from me. And also I couldn't get past some of the metaphysics, which just didn't sit well with me as a scientist. And then pretty quickly I figured, okay, the answer's got to come from virtue ethics.
Hmm.
And so I studied, the obvious place, Aristotle. Yep, great ideas, but what the hell is the practice? And so it's like, okay, that's interesting, but no. Then I went to Epicureanism. And Epicureanism also was kind of very interesting. It was actually much more practical. It kind of resonated, a lot of things resonated with me, not being afraid of death and not being afraid of the gods, emphasis on friendship and a simple life. All of that sounded good. But then I got to the part where, oh, no social and political involvement because that brings pain. And I thought, well, that's right. It does bring pain, but I can't see myself living a life without that sort of component to it. And then that is the time where I rediscovered Stoicism online, one of the resources from the Modern Stoicism uh, group. And I thought, Stoicism, wait a minute. That's right. That's Marcus Aurelius. I had read the Meditations when I was in college. And I thought, oh, Seneca. I had translated Seneca from Latin when I was in high school, and I said, but I never actually put them together. I never actually thought, "Oh, this is about a coherent philosophy of life." So
Yeah.
that piqued my attention, and it just happened that the first thing that I read was Epictetus's Discourses, and that immediately clicked,
Yeah.
immediately hooked me, and here we are.
That's a strangely common path, I think, that a lot of people go through, that they'll say they'd kind of come across Seneca and they'd kind of come across Marcus Aurelius, but they hadn't really connected it to Stoic philosophy in
Yeah.
general. People say, oh, yeah, I discovered Stoicism, but I sort of vaguely remember looking at Marcus and Seneca years ago. It's interesting. I think it's only recently people have started to talk more about Stoicism, whereas in the past they would just talk about Seneca, or
Yep.
they talk about Cicero, they talk about Marcus Aurelius, but not really about the philosophy itself. Well, and then you wrote How to Be a Stoic. What do you think I know that when you wrote that book, you were still kind of exploring Stoicism.
That's
It
right.
was kind of an experiment for you in a way, like in the laboratory of your own experience, as it were. So, what do you think you learned from the process of writing that book? Were you changed by the end of it? Like, what emerged from your experience of working on the book?
Yeah, that was an interesting experience. I was on sabbatical, and that was my project for the year. I moved to Rome for part of that year just to get inspiration, basically, and then I actually started traveling, tracking down many of the places where Epictetus was. I went to
Hmm.
Hierapolis, in modern Western Turkey. I went to Nicopolis in modern Western Greece, and yes, it was definitely a transformative experience, as I think running a book ought to be, really, right? I mean, you've had probably very similar experiences yourself. I mean, the thing is, people say sometimes that the best way to learn something is either to teach it to people or to
Yeah,
write a book about it, right?
yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And in fact, ever since I started writing books, usually my approach is I'm going to write a book that I would have loved to have read a few years
Yeah,
ago when I didn't know crap about this stuff.
yeah. That's what I've tried to do as well. I kind of think if I could go back in time,
Yep.
You know, what would I want to read? You know, kind of,
Exactly.
and
Exactly.
cross your fingers and hope that other people are going to want to read that as well. But it's not a bad strategy.
Yeah, that's right. It's actually. I mean, it worked. It certainly worked for me,
Yeah.
and the book turned out to be an interesting sort of hypothetical conversation with Epictetus, where I went into some personal experiences, and I asked my Epictetus, how would you deal with this kind of stuff? And
Uh-huh.
often I agree with Epictetus. In a few cases, I disagree. Like there is a
Uh-huh.
chapter, for instance, in How to Be a Stoic, where we talk. I talked to Epictetus a little bit about his view of the cosmos and the
Uh-huh.
harmony of the cosmos. And basically, the Stoics, just like Plato and
Yeah.
others, essentially subscribed to what we would today call a design argument to
Yeah.
infer that the world, is organized by some kind of
Yeah.
intelligence, right?
They love the argument from design.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I told Epictetus, sort of my hypothetical Epictetus, if I had lived 2,000 years ago, I would have wholeheartedly agree. I
Yeah.
think you got it right. But today with modern science, I mean, we got other things. Have you ever heard of these evolution stuff and so
Yeah.
on?
Darwin and stuff like that.
Yeah,
Like,
right.
and there's things in Epic. I love Epictetus, but there's definitely some crazy bits. Like,
Yes.
I think if I remember rightly, there's a bit in Epictetus where he talks about how austerity is good for your health because you don't, you see lots of elderly beggars or something like that, and it seems like a crazy argument. Like,
Yes, it's not exactly the best argument, right? I mean, but that's part of the thing, right? When I write about the Greeks and the Romans, often people ask the obvious question, which I think is perfectly legitimate, which is why should we be paying attention to people who lived 2.5 millennia ago? What do they have to say that is interesting to us? Surely a lot of this stuff has been superseded.
uh-huh.
And my answer is, well, look, if let's say that Socrates all of a sudden joined us in this conversation, right?
Uh-huh.
The first thing he would do, it would be really surprised at the technology that we're using, right? Like, wow, my gosh, this
Yeah.
laptop thing you're talking about, it allows you to talk, thousands of miles away. It's like, what the hell? He would definitely be surprised because, of course, our science and technology have advanced in ways that the Greco-Romans would have not been able to imagine. But then Socrates would sit down and listen to what you and I are actually talking about and say, "Oh yeah, I recognize this stuff. I know the general topic. I know what you're
Yeah.
talking about. You're talking about suffering. You're talking about dealing with setbacks. You're talking that stuff has not changed."
Yeah.
And so that is why I find not just the Greco-Romans, but you can say the same for Eastern cultures, for Buddhism, Taoism, and so on and so forth, or from other places in the world. But that is what is very valuable about these people. We shouldn't focus on the stuff that they got wrong, because of course everybody gets stuff wrong. You and I have written books, and who knows, 10 years, 20 years, 100 years down the road, assuming that anybody's actually going to read my books that far into the future, they'll look at it and say, wow, this guy really got several things spectacularly wrong.
Yeah.
But that isn't the point. The point is, what did they get right that early on, when there was no science to speak of, when there was no
Yeah.
systematic research into human psychology and happiness, and yet they got a lot of stuff right, which is still resonates with us today.
I can think of two reasons for that off the top of my head. One is that there's quite a lot of stuff you can figure out about psychology through reflection. Not by no means everything. There's a lot of things that are really difficult to figure out by reflection, but you can definitely arrive at a lot of insights through personal reflection. And they spent a lot of time doing that. And I would compare it to actually the level of sophistication that they have in rhetoric and oratory. So we can look
Yeah.
back at Greek and Roman oratory and think it's still pretty impressive. Like they have a really impressive technical knowledge of how to form compelling speeches because they were able to practice. They don't need a microscope to do that. They can practice it and observe how audiences respond. So they were pretty advanced in that regard. So perhaps it shouldn't surprise us so much if they made a lot of progress countering rhetoric as well, and as well as evoking passions in people. They were able to manage their passions. And the other reason, maybe you'll like this one as well, because I know you've got an interest in pseudoscience. I
Yes.
think one of the reasons that we look back at the Stoics, and I am genuinely humbled and kind of impressed sometimes by how advanced bits of Stoicism are. psychologically. They're way more advanced than in certain regards than a lot of the contemporary self-help literature, it
Yeah.
seems to me. And I think one reason for that is Freud, because Freud was so bad for
That's right.
the development of psychotherapy. Freud was a guy who wrote quite extensively about his love of science, but essentially was a massive pseudoscientist and pretty anti-science fundamentally. He held back the progress of scientific research in psychotherapy by at least half a century. And,
I would agree.
Yeah.
I would agree. Yeah, that whole chunk of psychotherapy, Freud, Jung, Adler, all these people, is like, yeah, they really they took the wrong turn, and they
They
set
took
back
a
things
wrong
by
turn.
decades. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And the funny thing is, we would have been into Stoicism 50 years earlier if it hadn't been for Freud, because there were late 19th century, early 20th century psychotherapists that were really into Seneca. But they were eclipsed by Freud and his Oedipus complex theory, so much so that they're completely forgotten about now. But if that had never happened, Stoicism would have got into psychotherapy about 50 years earlier, and it wouldn't seem as much of a revelation to us today. It would be more part of our culture, I think.
That's right.
I wanted to ask you, did you think that have you changed your mind about any aspects of Stoicism since you worked on that book and since you began, writing other books? Like, has your view of Stoicism evolved more recently?
Yeah, I think that's inevitable to some extent, right? Once you start getting into the nitty gritty details, and you also start comparing Stoicism to other philosophies, not just again Greco-Romans, but more widely, you say, okay, well, these people got a lot of stuff right. In fact, I still fundamentally consider myself a Stoic, but there are some things they didn't get right. Some of them are pretty obvious, like Cicero's criticism, for instance, of the Stoic endorsement of divination techniques
Yeah.
is pretty right on target. As you mentioned, my interest in pseudoscience, Cicero is considered the first author in the Western canon, basically, to address systematically an issue of pseudoscience.
Mm-hmm.
He writes about divination, astrology, and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So they got that stuff wrong, but that's not very worrisome. I think that's really falls under the science part of things, and so it's not very surprising that they got something wrong.
Yeah.
I think that the more important part, at least for me, is that Stoicism does seem to lack either awareness or at least a taking seriously of structural problems as opposed to personal ones, right? So when it comes to ethics, there are these two ways of looking at things, that either the personal level, so what is up to me and what is not up to me, given the background conditions that I'm experiencing, what can I do here? And that's obviously very powerful and very helpful. But then there is also the structural level, like, okay, but if I live in a dictatorship, for instance, or if I am experiencing a horrible job conditions because my boss takes advantage of me or something like that, well, those are structural issues. Those are not just dependent on me. And so they need to be addressed at a more collective level, at a more societal level. Stoicism doesn't have that. To be fair, not many philosophies have that, right? Buddhism doesn't have it either.
That's true. And it may also be that they said a bit more about it in books that don't survive today, because there was a tradition, we believe, of Stoic experts in jurisprudence who may have had more to say about reforming the Roman legal system, for example, and rights and so on. But we only have a small fraction of what the Stoics wrote. We can kind of guess that what survives is important to them, but they must have said some other things that we've lost.
Yeah, no, you're right. There is some discussion in sort of the scholarly literature. For instance, what's his name? Sadly, has published a couple of papers arguing that, yes, despite the big caveat that you just put forth, which is we've lost a lot of what the Stoics wrote, it does seem that there is really something inherent in the philosophy about, well, the background, the government you live under is a preferred or dispreferred and different, that sort of stuff. But you're right. It's always a good idea to keep in mind that we have lost a lot. But some of our concerns, right, both yours and mine, is to bring Stoicism up to the 21st century. And so regardless of whether the ancient Stoics did concern themselves or not, we certainly should. And that's where there's some work to be done, I think.
Absolutely, definitely. Actually, to going back a bit, I was going to ask you, I'm just curious, did your kind of concern, maybe is the right word, about pseudoscience, do you think your concern about pseudoscience was one of the things that motivated your interest in philosophy?
Yes, it was, because my first entry in philosophy, later after my high school bout, as an adult, was in philosophy of science. For obvious reasons, because I was a scientist, but specifically what is now actually called, there is a sub-branch now of philosophy of science that is referred to as philosophy of pseudoscience, because I've always been interested in what philosophers call the demarcation problem. What exactly separates science from pseudoscience? Why is it that certain epistemic activities, as they're referred to, seems to be so successful and others are just don't go anywhere? And why do people believe things in one way or another? That sort of. So that has always been one of my interests, and that was one of my entry points into philosophy.
That's something maybe you have in common with Socrates, arguably, in a sense, because he started studying natural philosophy originally, allegedly under Anaxagoras, and then got kind of frustrated with it and began to question the whole methodology. But also the way that Socrates reacts to the sophists. You could say he's the type of guy, and other early philosophers saw sophistry and thought, I'm kind of done with other people's BS. Like I need to start doing philosophy just to kind of get past, cut through all of this smokescreen of rhetoric. Right. And I think today people get fed up with the BS of kind of political rhetoric and pseudoscience, and it's one of the things. Frustration with other people's BS is one of the things that drives people to study philosophy more deeply, perhaps.
I agree.
Ironically.
Ironically. I agree. And in fact, you mentioned, so I mentioned a minute ago that Cicero is the first one who started writing systematically about pseudoscience. But Socrates, actually, there's a bit in the Charmides where he does bring up the issue. He doesn't go into details. But at some point in the Charmides by Plato, Socrates raises the question of what is the difference between a real doctor and a quack. Mm-hmm. And he says, would the wise man been able to tell the difference? And there's this nice little dialogue where at some point he says, no, the wise man won't be able to tell the difference because he has to be not only wise, but also a doctor. In other words, if he doesn't have expertise, then he won't be able to tell bullshit from the real thing. And it's a really interesting, it's a really compelling sort of statement there that it's surprising in that early on in the history of Western thought.
Yeah, it's always been around. People have always been concerned about being led down the garden path by fake experts, right?
Exactly.
I want to dig a little bit into your more recent book, The Quest for Character. But before we get on to that, I just wanted to ask you briefly about your involvement with the Modern Stoicism team, and particularly, what do you make in general of the modern resurgence of interest in Stoicism? Like, why are people suddenly? It's been like over a decade now, or pushing 20 years. But why are people now much more interested in Stoicism than they were in the past?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, which I've been asking myself a number of times, and I have some suggestions. But I think that what really would be interesting is if a PhD student in sociology or social psychology would actually sit down and do a thesis on this thing, because there is quite a bit to be done there. I suspect that the resurgence of Stoicism is the result over the last 10, 20 years, is the result of a number of factors. One of them is the receding of classical religions. A lot of people, not only in the United States, but certainly across Western countries, in fact, more so in other Western countries than the United States, over the last 10, 20, 30 years, have begun to disassociate themselves from standard, mainstream religions. But even if you do, which doesn't mean that they turn into atheism, it just means that they don't find good answers, satisfying answers in mainstream religion. But once you do that, you still need an answer to your questions. You still need a framework. You still need something to go on, just like it happened with me and secular humanism. And so I suspect that that is one reason, obviously, for the resurgence not only of Stoicism, but also for Western interest in Buddhism, for instance, or even in other Eastern philosophies like Taoism and to a lesser extent Confucianism. That's one reason. The other reason is we are living in a time that is in some respects not very different from the kind of turmoil, social and political turmoil that characterized the explosion of the Hellenistic philosophies
Mhm.
in the Western world, as well as, in fact, about a century or so earlier in India, the origin of Buddhism, and about at the same time in China, the origin of Confucianism. That is, we live in a world where things change very rapidly. There are major challenges that we individually have very little say about, or we can do very few things about, like climate change, for instance. We just went through a pandemic, uh, wars, political turmoil, all of that sort of stuff is the sort of thing that makes you. Of course, let's also not forget that last century we went through 2 world wars. So those are the kind of things that really generate anxiety and existential anxiety. And so I think that Stoicism is certainly one very good way of doing so, of responding to that kind of need. But also there are, I guess, more pragmatic kinds of reasons. Like, the very fact that there is a dedicated group of people like you guys when you study the Modern Stoicism group. I mean, sometimes that's all it takes for people to rediscover things. It's somebody's initiative. Somebody says, hey, more people should know about this. Let's get together and get it done. I mean, nobody's, as far as I know, has organized the Stoicon or Stoic Week equivalent for
Yeah.
Epicureanism or skepticism or
I
anything
was,
like that,
I was
right?
going to ask about that. Why? What when we first met with John Sellers and Christopher Gill and Jules Evans and everybody, and we started planning the kind of initial Stoic week, I wholeheartedly assumed that within a year or two there would be Epicurus week and
Right.
Aristotle week, and that all of these things would flourish. And then whatever it is now, like 10 years later, I'm still waiting. Like, and I thought, why isn't there an Epicurean movement? There are Epicurean communities, but they're pretty small
Yeah.
compared to the Stoicism communities online. There's been attempts to publish modern self-help books on Epicurus and Aristotle, but
Hmm.
they haven't really taken off in the way Stoicism is everywhere. Like, it's taken over on podcasts and online articles in a way that those other branches of ancient philosophy haven't. Now, I'm curious what your thoughts are. I mean, I can understand why there isn't a cynicism week, right? I
That's
do.
right.
From the outset, I thought live like Diogenes. I thought is going to be pretty niche, but
Yes.
why not Epicureanism and
Although that
skepticism? And
that would definitely be entertaining. A Cynic Week would definitely be entertaining. Yeah, I think that's a great question. And again, I can only guess here. I think that the answer is going to be different for different philosophies. For Aristotle, for instance, it's just not practical. It's great stuff in theory, but it doesn't really seem to pay much attention to how do you actually translate this into techniques, into ascesis, into exercises and stuff like that. Is just not practical. Also, frankly, Aristotle, by today's standards, seems like blah. I mean, like what
yeah,
all he's saying is, well, go in the middle. Choose moderation.
yeah,
You need a little bit of this and a little bit of that. Well, sure, okay, but that's not a big revelation, right? It's not going to be triggering the kind of aha moments that I've had certainly when I read Epictetus. So that's
yeah,
that's one thing. Epicureanism is a little bit more puzzling because you would think that Epicureanism would be a good competitor today, just as it was in fact in ancient Greece and Rome. I suspect that Epicureanism has suffered from a couple of things. First of all, for being associated with label as the sex, drugs, and rock and roll of philosophy, which it certainly wasn't. But today, the word Epicurean, all these words have changed meaning, right? Cynic doesn't mean today what it meant early on. Same goes for Stoic. But Epicureanism, I think, or skeptic for that matter. But Epicureanism, I think, it has been the most distorted from the initial version, so that when people hear about, oh, Epicurus, like, oh, you mean I need to go and indulge in some kind of orgies and stuff myself? It's like, well, no, that's not it. But also, there is that issue of disengagement from political and social involvement. And I do think that we live in a society where, especially young people, do prize that kind of involvement. Yes, it's difficult. Yes, it's frustrating. Yes, it's painful. Um, but I don't see a lot of people today just saying, you know what, let's buy a piece of land and build our garden and fence it off and just stay there. Not a let the rest of the world go do whatever the hell they want to do.
And that kind of live in obscurity aspect of
Yeah,
Epicureanism may have undermined the incentive to build
yeah,
online communities as well. I'd also say, from my perspective, there's a reason that Epicureanism isn't popular with modern day psychologists and psychotherapists
mm.
in the way that Stoicism is. And that's because certain aspects of Epicureanism really clash with clinical practice in CBT.
Interesting.
Um, it would take a little while to kind of explain, but we know, for instance, that people who respond strongly in the affirmative to the statement anxiety is bad tend to have lower emotional resilience over the long term. And belief that anxiety is bad is pretty close to the central ethical doctrine of Epicureanism, that ataraxia, or freedom from disturbance and anxiety, is the highest good. So this kind of emphasis on the value and control of subjective feelings of pleasure and pain is now seen as highly problematic psychologically.
That's
Um,
interesting.
and so there's a reason it hasn't kind of taken off. And another reason I'd mention is, I know Epicureans might disagree with this, but let's take the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius as an example. I don't think the Epicureans or the Aristotelians, or maybe most of these other ancient philosophies, have a text comparable to the Meditations in terms of its popular appeal and accessibility.
I agree, and that's certainly part of the picture. Yeah, and then there is the skeptics. Now, the skeptic. Yeah, I'm very interested in skepticism, particularly in the version that Cicero articulated, which is very friendly to Stoicism, as it turns out. But it's not. It doesn't endorse Stoicism completely. But the problem with skepticism is it's more an attitude than a philosophy of life, right? It's an attitude about, I need to keep my mind open to the fact that no matter what I think I know, I could be wrong, and that I need to consider things in terms of probabilities and not in terms of truth versus false. And I think it's a great attitude. I mean, I think this is the kind of attitude we should all cultivate, but it doesn't really necessarily amount to a philosophy, to a full-fledged philosophy of life, which is why Cicero himself was essentially a Stoic with some modifications, some variations.
And I wanted to ask also about your latest book, The Quest for Character, which
Mm-hmm.
is, I think I'm about halfway through reading it. So it's got some stuff about the Stoics in it, but its main focus is on Socrates and also on Alcibiades. So, first of all, I wanted to ask, why write about Socrates?
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, the original idea of the book was really to write about the relationship between the two, between Socrates and Alcibiades. As you know, a lot has been written on Socrates. I'm sure a lot more will be written because he's an endlessly fascinating character. Alcibiades, on the other hand, I've always been puzzled by why is it that this guy is
Yeah.
not better known, right? Not as a role model, because he's definitely not a role model. But I'm still surprised to this day that I don't think there is a movie or a TV series on Alcibiades' life, which would be fascinating, right? I mean, the guy was impossibly handsome, uber rich, of noble descent, brave, dashing. He had it all.
I don't think there's anything in Athens commemorating him, incidentally.
Really?
Uh,
Yeah,
there's
see, so
nothing, which is kind of surprising. I'll tell
it's
you something that might surprise you. In the city hall in Athens,
mm-hmm.
I went to see the mayor a while back, and when I got inside and I was walking up the stairs, I noticed they had a bust of Pericles in the middle of the building, which didn't
Interesting.
surprise me. But beside it, there's a bust of Aspasia.
Really? Oh, that's
Yeah,
good.
yeah.
That's interesting.
What I thought was really cool, and it kind of surprised me a bit. But I don't, as far as I'm aware, there isn't anything
About
commemorating
Alcibiades. Yeah.
Alcibiades.
Yeah, exactly. So the original idea was like, okay, here's these two characters. Alcibiades is a student and friend of Socrates. And he goes in the Alcibiades Mire, which is a dialogue attributed to Plato, although it's not clear whether Plato actually wrote it or not. But no matter what no matter what, it is an ancient dialogue written in the
Yeah,
style of Plato. And it's a fascinating dialogue because a very young Alcibiades goes to Socrates and says, look, I got all these things going for me. I think I need to be, leading Athens. I want to get into politics, etc. And, what do you think? And Socrates basically sets him down for the equivalent of what we would today call a job interview. And he says, okay, sure. So let's hear here. What would you be your priorities? Why would you do things, etc.
I was kind of
And
giving him careers guidance.
yeah, and it becomes very clear quickly that Alcibiades just does not have what it takes because he's missing the most important thing. He's
Yeah,
going into this enterprise for glory, for self-aggrandizement. He's a narcissist, but no, he's not. He doesn't really have an interest in making things better for Athens and for the people. And so there is this wonderful bit at some point in the dialogue where Socrates says, "Then, alas, Alcibiades, what a condition you suffer from. I hesitate to name it, but it must be said. You are wedded to stupidity, best of men, of the most extreme sort, as the argument accuses you and you accuse yourself. So this is why you're leaping into the affairs of the city before you've been educated." Now, the stupidity that Socrates is talking about is really lack of wisdom.
By the way, Alcibiades punched people in the face for less.
Yes.
He really did. We're told. So,
Yes. Yeah, it was a really bizarre character. And so, so that kind of got me started on this notion of, okay, so what is the relationship here, therefore, between character and wisdom on one hand and leadership and on the other hand? So why is it that it's so difficult to find statesmen and politicians who actually have a good character? What is so troublesome
yeah.
about this thing? Why is it we find a lot more Alcibiades than Socrates in this business?
But
And that was the idea.
what you've said raises another, I think, is another obvious question, which is, what on earth then did Socrates see in Alcibiades? Because
Yeah.
he invested a lot of time, and he risked his reputation, like obviously, like in being associated with Alcibiades. So he must have seen some potential in him. And sometimes with the histories, actually, they're so kind of biased one way or the other. It's difficult to understand why Socrates would have given this guy the time of day.
Yeah, that is a good question. I mean, the book, The Quest for Character, has an entire chapter on Alcibiades' life, where I kind of try to disentangle all these different threads of, and it was complicated. It is true, for instance, that he certainly was a brilliant general. There's no question about it. I mean, the guy, after he had defected first to Sparta and then to the Persians, somehow he found his way back to Athens. He was welcomed back, and Athens by that point was really in dire straits in terms of the Peloponnesian War. They were basically done because this was after the ill-fated expedition against Syracuse, which destroyed a great part of the Athenian army and basically all of its navy. And yet Alcibiades takes control and he wins a string of victories one
Yeah.
after another,
Yeah.
and almost tips the balance of the war on the other side. So the guy certainly had brilliance. But you're right; it's a good question. What exactly did Socrates find in him?
And he was definitely a highly charismatic orator.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely, exactly. And so maybe Socrates thought that if he could redirect sort of some of the impulses in the right direction, then maybe this guy would actually be fulfilling his potential. But to me, the most interesting thing is, which I explained in the following chapter, which is about Socrates. On the other hand, most interesting thing is that we tend to be used, we tend to think of Socrates as it comes across in the Platonic dialogues, and for good reasons. Though that's a major source of what we know about Plato. But of course, there are other sources. One of the most important one of which, as you know, is Xenophon.
Yeah.
In particular, the Memorabilia, which was, of course, also the book that inspired Zeno
Yeah.
to get into philosophy and start Stoicism, right? But in the Memorabilia, you get a far more, in my opinion at least, far more dynamic and interesting view of Socrates, who talks to everybody about all sorts of things. So it's in a sense it's less philosophical, but
Yeah.
more practical, right? I
Yeah.
mean, there's one of my favorite bits is where he actually enters in conversation with a courtesan and gives her
Yeah.
business advice, right?
Theodota.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was great. But the relevant in terms of the discussion we're having, the more interesting thing in my mind is that Socrates, apparently, according to Xenophon at least, uh, explicitly saw himself as playing this role of advising people whether to get into politics or not. And he does that repeatedly. First of all, there's a bit in the Memorabilia where a sophist, Antiphon, actually criticized Socrates for not getting in politics himself. And and Socrates' response is, well, how now, Antiphon? Should I play a more important part in politics by engaging them in them alone, or by taking pains to turn out as many competent politicians as possible? That's very revealing, and we have a number of examples. So he advises Alcibiades not to do it. So there is this often this point is brought up is like, oh, look at Socrates failed with Alcibiades. Well, not exactly, because he did tell him not to do it. He told him don't get into politics because he saw that he wasn't going to go very well. He also advises Glaucon, Plato's brother, not to get into politics. There's this really wonderful bit in the Memorabilia where he basically does a very practical, Socrates does a very practical examination of Glaucon, asking him details about the Athenian garrison and how much grain do we get and all that sort of stuff. And at the end, he says, please don't do it. And Glaucon does not do it. He becomes a musician, apparently. And then Socrates advises Charmides, who was Glaucon's son. And this time he says, you are one of those people that should get into politics. And Charmides does. Unfortunately for Charmides, his timing is not very good because he does it during the reign of the 30 tyrants. So that didn't go very well. But his art was in the right place. And then there is yet another character, Euthydemus, who also initially thinks that he knows everything and he can get into politics. And Socrates says, no, it's really not that kind of person. And Euthydemus, to his credit, realizes Socrates is right, and he becomes a follower of Socrates. He gives up politics. So there's this pattern. It's not just Alcibiades. Socrates really thought of himself as kind of being on the outside and advising people whether to embark in a political career or not. And it's very interesting.
Yeah. I mean, like historians could have hours of fun speculating about what would the outcome of the Peloponnesian War have been if Alcibiades hadn't got involved at all.
Yep.
Like, if he just, and also I was going to say, the way you're describing Socrates, it sounds a little bit like we could compare his role to somebody running a political think tank. He's kind of on the sidelines of politics, educating and advising.
Exactly.
Um, he
A
doesn't.
one-man think tank.
The one-man think tank. Yeah. I was going to ask you, actually, leading on from that previous comment, if you have any views about this. What do you think Alcibiades' biggest flaws were then? And do you have an opinion about what his biggest mistake was in practice?
In practice, yeah. So his biggest flaw, I think, is the one that Socrates points out. That is, he suffers from hubris, which of course is
Hubris, yeah.
the quintessential problem for a lot of mythological or historical figures in ancient Greece. I mean, he thinks that he can do a lot more than he actually can. He also, has, however, the wrong motivations, again, as Socrates points out. In terms of,
I was going to say, people might think this is a bit lame as an explanation, but I can't help but look at Alcibiades and think that he also possibly has some daddy issues, because he has to live up to the example of Pericles.
Yes.
And he seems to me to be a guy who's desperate to outdo Pericles.
Yeah. And not only Pericles, because he was the adopted son of Pericles, but also his lineage. I mean, he came from a very distinguished Athenian family, who one of his ancestors was, kicked out, the last tyrant of Athens. So yeah, he had a big, comparisons to stand up to in terms of who came before him. So yeah, there might be some interesting psychological issues there. In terms of practical mistakes, um, that is a very good question. I think the first of a series of practical mistakes, but probably the turning point, was when he defected from Athens, because he was brought up for charges for allegedly having defaced the Hermes, these sacred images, right, statues. We don't know whether he did it or not, or whether it was a plot by his enemies or something. Arguably, the thing to do would have been, in fact, to go back to Athens and face charges. But, that could have ended up, pretty dicey circumstances. So I don't blame him necessarily for, skipping. But what does he do? He goes to Sparta, which is understandable because his family was actually the Athenian representative, diplomatic representative to Sparta. So he had friends there, he had connections. That makes perfect sense. But then he starts very effectively advising the Spartans against the Athenians, right? That, I think, was his mistake, because up to that point, he was simply somebody who was possibly the target of a political conspiracy, was trying to save his skin, and he sought asylum. Fine. Up to that point, he could have recovered. But once you start advising your hosts against your own city, and then start rationalizing why you're doing this, then now you actually started down a rabbit hole from which you're not going to emerge. And sure enough, it doesn't emerge in the end. He dies tragically, a number of years later.
I think he kind of goes out in a blaze of glory in a way as well.
Yes.
He's a tragic hero, but to some anyway. But I actually think one of his biggest mistakes, I agree with you, but I'd add to that, when he allegedly cheated in the chariot races
Oh,
in
yes.
the Panathenaic Games. So it seems to me the Athenians felt that he'd gone, they held that against him for many years afterwards. And that was his hubris showing. So they became suspicious of him after that. And the accusation was that he wanted to make himself into a tyrant over Athens. So I think that Socrates must have looked at that and thought, this is exactly what I was kind of warning him not to do.
Yep.
Which leads me on to another question. This is a tricky one, Massimo. So I don't know. You might have to think about this one a little bit, but I think you're in a good position to do it. Do you think, in a parallel universe, Alcibiades would have turned out any differently if a Stoic like Epictetus, who focused more on self-discipline, arguably, had been his tutor rather than Socrates? What would have happened if he'd had an Epictetus as his tutor? Would Epictetus have been a better mentor for Alcibiades?
That is a great question. So let me run my parallel universe simulation and come up with an answer. As much as I, of course, have a huge amount of admiration for Epictetus, I don't think so. And here's why. I think it was too late. So we, in the next to the last chapter in the book goes into the more general issue of character. What is it? What do we know about it from the point of view of modern science? Does it change? How does it change? Can you do something about it? And the consensus seems to be that character, which is a series of behavioral dispositions, right? So if you have a certain character trait, let's say generosity, that just means that other things being equal, you tend to act generously. Not necessarily always, but you have a tendency, and so on. Same goes for vices, right? If you're stingy, then you tend to be stingy most of the times, etc. Now, the evidence seems to be that character is formed. Part of it is probably innate. So part of it is probably a matter of genetics. We just like we have other natural predispositions or lack thereof, like music, for music or for languages or something like that. It's the same goes for pretty much any human behavioral trait. But the part that is not genetic, the component that is actually pliable, seems to be largely, not completely, but largely set by one's late teens or early 20s, which makes sense because that's the time when the human brain basically settles down. And after that, you can still do things. You can still, of course, learn. A good analogy here is with learning a musical instrument or a language. You can definitely do it pretty much at any time in your life, but the more you wait, the more difficult it is, and the less good you're going to get at it, right? And so I suspect that Alcibiades was already sufficiently set that not even Epictetus would have been able necessarily to alter things. In the central part of the book, I go through a number of other examples of both success and failures when it comes to either philosophers trying to advise politicians, such as for instance Plato twice with the tyrants of Syracuse, Dionysius the first and the second. Dionysius the first and the second, as well as examples of politicians or statesmen who themselves are interested in philosophy and seek advice. Obviously, for instance, Marcus Aurelius, Cicero, Cato the Younger, etc. And the pattern that emerges from those examples, I think, is pretty clear. It almost never works when a philosopher comes to an adult or almost adult individual who has shown no inclination toward virtue and wisdom and tries to teach it. It always ends in either catastrophe or in not a particular good way. By contrast, when somebody has the internal motivation and seeks advice, or especially early on in life, that's where you see the results. And so the general, I think, idea is that if we really want to, improve people's characters, we better do it early on. And it's one interesting question of why don't we? Because we usually don't, right? We don't teach moral philosophy, for instance, practical moral philosophy to our kids, and we should.
Well, let's open that up because that leads neatly on to what was going to be my final question. I was saving to last, but you've started to kind of lead into it already there. Mm-hmm. So the concluding question that I wanted to put to you for this episode was, how do you, based on the book that you've written and your other research, what do you feel we could be doing to do a better job of teaching virtue today? Like, what can we learn from this? How could we do a better job in general of improving character and teaching virtue?
Well, I would say that we need to start doing it, because as I said, most of the times we actually don't do it at all. So it's not even a question of doing a better job; it's just to do a job. But it's a good question. I think there are a couple of things that emerge from both the experience of the Greco-Romans as well as from modern science. For one thing, the Greco-Romans were right that the age of reason, which is when kids start being able to formulate abstract thoughts and stuff like that, and that happens usually around 7-8 years old or something like that. That's when you want to start teaching practical philosophy, and we don't. With very few exceptions. One of the really interesting exceptions is is illustrated very clearly in a documentary that I saw recently called Young Plato.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I saw it too.
Right, yeah. So it's set in Belfast in Northern Ireland, and it's about an elementary school principal who starts teaching practical philosophy to his kids to help them deal with their day-to-day challenges and setbacks. And it's fascinating. It's exactly the kind of things that we should be doing, but of course we, by and large, don't. So that's one thing. The other thing is that modern science has actually looked into this issue of character. There is one of my favorite books in that department is The Character Gap by Christian Miller, who is a psychologist. And he's compiled a number of things that work and don't work when it comes to improving our character and our virtue. And it might come as no surprise to us who practice ancient philosophy that a lot of these things were actually intuited or known already by the likes of Seneca, Cicero, and so forth. So, for instance, the kind of things that does work, the techniques that work, is adopting role models. Does that sound familiar? Yeah, right. This is what Seneca tells us to do all the time. To critically reflect on your actions. In other words, do something like journaling. In other words, writing your own meditations, a la Marcus Aurelius, that sort of stuff. That works. purposely avoiding certain situations that you know might be challenging. Epictetus tells you to do that all the time, right? He says, look, you are not good enough yet to resist temptation. You need to avoid temptation altogether. You need to not get into situations that you know are going to be challenging if you're not ready to
Yeah.
to handle that challenge. We also know of things that don't work. One of the things that don't work, perhaps not surprisingly, is doing nothing. But by doing nothing, what Miller means is like we have this general notion that, oh, you get older and you get wiser. No, you don't. Not by default. I mean, you get old and you get crankier. That's true, but not necessarily wiser. Wisdom comes, yes, from experience. You do. It does require experience, but it requires mindful, critical evaluations of your experiences. If you don't do that, if you don't engage with your experience, you're not learning crap. So you're just getting old. You're not getting any wiser. Another thing that doesn't work is nudging. These techniques that are actually very effective in terms of behavioral modification, but not in terms of character modification. Those two are not the same thing, right? So nudging, an example of nudging is these days a company that wants its employees, for instance, to get into a retirement plan or opt into a healthcare plan. What they do is, instead of asking them, "Do you want this?" You need to fill out a form. They automatically enroll their employees, and then the employees has to file a form if they want to disengage, to be unenrolled, right? So it's basically changing the default. And the nudging on that sort works very well in terms of behavior modification. Yes, more people will stay with healthcare or with retirement. But because it's not actually a conscious, reflective, critical decision, it doesn't actually affect your character. You're not getting more virtues. You're just getting, you're lazy, and that's why you don't change things. And then the last thing that doesn't work, there's pretty good empirical evidence that doesn't work, is virtue labeling. We're told to go to our kids and tell them that they're brilliant, that they're great, that they're blah blah, all this sort of stuff, even when they're patently not. Well, that turns out now there is enough studies to show that that thing actually doesn't work. It doesn't make people any better than they were before.
Yeah, that makes them into Alcibiades. It makes them little narcissists or whatever. That's been incredibly insightful, Massimo. It's been a pleasure talking to you as always. Thanks very much for joining us today. Do you have anything else that you wanted to add before we wrap things up?
No, I think the only thing to say is just, guys, keep reading about the Greeks and the Romans, because there is a ton of stuff that we can still learn today. And thanks for having me, Don. It was very, very much a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure. And thank you, everyone, for listening to Stoicism, Philosophy as a Way of Life. Be sure to share the link with your friends. I'm looking forward to next time. But for now, it's goodbye from this episode's guest, Massimo Pigliucci, and from me, Donald Robertson.